Welcome to the second of two videos about coordinated entry in the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. This second video reviews how coordinated entry is set up in the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care, including the planning behind and the process of coordinated entry. In this video, I will discuss go-to resources for the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care and our coordinated entry guiding principles. Then I will discuss who is involved in coordinated entry, how coordinated entry works, and the role of HMIS. Before we dive into the details, I want to highlight 3 resources that will help you and your community continue to learn and understand coordinated entry. We have a coordinated entry section on the Texas Homeless Network website. On that website, you'll also find information about our agency's work as the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care lead agency and HMIS lead. You can also learn more about our statewide initiatives. Next, we have a Systems Change Toolkit. This toolkit is intended for all audiences. It's a great starting point for communities who are new to coordinated entry. And lastly, there are the coordinated entry written standards. Every continuum of care is responsible for developing and updating written standards that describe the policies and procedures for coordinated entry. In addition, in the Texas Balance of State, there are regional policies and procedures which follow the written standards but include details specific to that region. There are 7 principles that guide our approach to coordinated entry in the Texas Balance of State. First, we are guided by person-centered care. Every person should be treated with dignity and respect, which means providers should draw on people's expertise and strengths. Households should be made aware of all of their options and offered a choice. Staff must help people in crisis regain a sense of control while focusing on the person's goals, choices, and preferences. Second, we are guided by a crisis resolution approach. Homelessness is a crisis. Responses must include rapid assessment and triaging, focus on personal safety as the first priority, de-escalation of the person's emotional reaction, identifying action steps the individual can successfully achieve, and returning the person control over their problem solving. Third, we are guided by trauma-informed care. There is a high prevalence of trauma in the lives of people experiencing a housing crisis. Trauma can influence the mental, emotional, and physical well-being of individuals seeking services. Every provider should provide services in a manner that is welcoming and appropriate to the needs of those affected by trauma. Next, we are guided by a housing-first approach. Housing First prioritizes rapid placement and stabilization in permanent housing and does not have service participation requirements or preconditions such as sobriety or a minimum income threshold. In order to be effective, the coordinated entry process must be Housing First oriented, such that people are housed quickly without preconditions or service participation requirements. We are also guided by a low barrier approach. Since all people are considered housing ready, projects allow households to enroll regardless of their income, current or past substance use, or criminal records, with the exceptions of restrictions imposed by federal, state, or local law or ordinance. Next, we are guided by collaboration. Responsibility to a large coverage area means collaboration must be at the core of our system. And lastly, we are guided by data-driven decision-making. Performance and data should drive decisions to enhance the overall system. This includes inputting data accurately into the Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS, in a timely manner, and using HMIS to understand the system's strengths and weaknesses. Decisions and modifications can then be made based on accurate and timely data towards enhancing the overall system. These 7 principles not only guide our approach to coordinated entry, but they also guide our ultimate goal in making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. Who's involved in coordinated entry? In the Texas bounds of state, at a minimum, agencies with projects funded by the following sources are required to participate in coordinated entry: Continuum of Care Program, Emergency Solutions Grant Program, Supportive Services for Veteran Families Program, and VA Medical Centers. While there are requirements for who is involved based on federal programming, I want to stress that it takes all providers to establish and operate coordinated entry. We know that all providers do the most and the best they can to support households experiencing homelessness regardless of their funding sources. The management of coordinated entry can also be described in two ways. First, there is the planning for coordinated entry. This includes the development and evaluation of policies and procedures from the local level to the continuum of care level. Then there's the coordinated entry process itself. This refers to the day-to-day operation of the coordinated entry process, and both have a tremendous impact on each other. In planning for coordinated entry, there is the Continuum of Care itself and Texas Homeless Network serving as the lead agency and HMIS lead for the Continuum of Care. Then there is the Coordinated Entry Steering Committee, which is the committee of the Continuum of Care and made up of representatives from each coordinated entry planning entity. On the right side, with the coordinated entry process, there are entry points who enroll households into coordinated entry, and receiving agencies who use coordinated entry to fill availabilities in their projects. There are also non-participating agencies. These agencies may not necessarily be entry points or receiving agencies, but they play a key role in supporting households, especially through emergency services or doing local advocacy work. This map displays the current 17 coordinated entry regions in the Texas bounds of state. Because the geographic coverage of the Texas bounds of state is so large, it includes 215 counties, regions were established to support the day-to-day operation of coordinated entry and incorporate the local community's contacts and needs into the coordinated entry process. As I stated in the previous video, there are 4 core elements of the coordinated entry system. These components are access, assessment, referrals, and prioritization. And next, I'll walk through the coordinated entry process at a high level in the Texas bounds of state. So here's a process flowchart that provides a very brief overview of the coordinated entry process. First, a household experiencing homelessness or a housing crisis would go to an entry point for services. Assessors at the entry point will work to understand their situation through a step called diversion. Most providers already do some sort of diversion. We have defined it as conversations or problem-solving strategies that work to connect households to resources already available to them. For instance, perhaps someone needs mediation services with their landlord in order to keep their current housing. Or maybe someone needs to be connected to family members in a different city for permanent housing. This is where we would have those conversations. Some households may be able to resolve their housing crisis and be connected to permanent housing. At the same time, households are always connected to community services, for which they are eligible and will like referrals. These referrals may look like connecting to a family violence center, emergency shelter, or mainstream services like food or rental assistance. If a household was not able to resolve their housing crisis through diversion, which may take up to 14 days, they can be enrolled into coordinated entry if they are Category 1 or Category 4 homeless. Category 1 refers to literally homeless, and Category 4 refers to people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. It's important to note that while all households may come to an entry point for services, only households who are Category 1 or 4 homeless can enroll into coordinated entry to receive referrals and match to rapid rehousing, transitional housing, or permanent supportive housing. When assessors enroll households into coordinated entry, they are using HMIS to collect basic and personal information and to complete an assessment. We use a standardized assessment tool that captures the household situation and vulnerability. After the assessment is completed, the assessment will provide a score based on the household's vulnerability and recommends certain housing interventions for that household, including rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. At the same time, the assessor will let them know if there are any resources in the community for which they are eligible and would like a referral. It's expected that assessors connect the household to all referrals, including housing interventions and community resources, during their enrollment through a warm handoff. For households that completed an assessment and were referred to and accepted referrals for rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, they are placed on the housing priority list for the region. In many regions, there is some time between a referral and an opening in a project. Once there is an opening, regions can use their regional housing priority list to find households and fill a receiving project's opening. The coordinated entry process impacts and is impacted by racial inequities. Nationally, people of color are overrepresented in the homeless population, and this is due to historic and ongoing structural racism. As a result, it's important for us to examine the coordinated entry process to ensure that we are not perpetuating racial disparities. What do we mean when we talk about equity and racial equity? Equity refers to the proportional representation by race, class, gender of opportunities in housing, healthcare, employment, and all indicators of living a healthy life. Equity is different from equality. Equality is about sameness, and equity is about fairness. To achieve equity, policies and procedures may result in an unequal distribution of resources, but will lead to equitable outcomes for everyone. Racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted, in a statistical sense, one's housing, economic, and health outcomes. Racial equity includes addressing root causes of inequities, not just their outcomes. It's also a process where those who are most impacted by racial disparities are part of decision-making and planning. To center equity and racial equity in our work, we can begin by asking ourselves questions about the planning and process of coordinated entry. As stated before, these are the two ways we can describe the management of coordinated entry in the Texas balance of state. When we examine equity and who is planning coordinated entry in a region and at the continuum of care level, we should consider who comprises the planning body. Using data, where are there disparities in access, services, housing, and more? What are some strategies, policies, programs, or practices to mitigate those disparate factors? When we examine equity in the coordinated entry process, we should consider, for access, who knows how to access coordinated entry, and where or how is outreach and marketing being conducted? For assessment, who is administering the tool and who is getting assessed? For prioritization, which population has the continuum of care and/or region decided to prioritize? What role does the assessment tool play in prioritization? And lastly, for referral, who is getting housed into which intervention? What services are included? And who is declining services and why? We know that these questions do not cover all of the possible ways that racial inequities can happen in the coordinated entry process. Our goal with discussing it here during training is to encourage discussions at the regional level which can inform changes to coordinated entry. Coordinated entry is meant to be dynamic and updated continuously as we work through it from the local to the continuum of care level. As you can see, the coordinated entry process is detail-oriented. In addition to having one-on-one conversations with households, staff members must use HMIS to facilitate the coordinated entry process. In the Texas Balance of State, ClientTrack is the vendor for HMIS, and HMIS is used mainly in two ways. First, HMIS facilitates and documents the coordinated entry process for a household. Agencies use HMIS to collect information about the household, complete the coordinated entry assessment tool, record referrals made for a household, and facilitate their progress towards permanent housing. Agencies can use HMIS to communicate with one another about a household. Second, HMIS can help regions evaluate the coordinated entry process system-wide. Data can be pulled from the system to help regions understand, for example, who is enrolling into coordinated entry, how many are moving on to permanent housing or a permanent housing program, which agencies are receiving referrals from the coordinated entry process. It's important to note that coordinated entry is not just data entry into HMIS. It is a process supported by multiple agencies and typically spans an extended period of time. As a result, the Texas Balance of State has set up coordinated entry as a program in HMIS for all relevant agencies to access. We understand that using the term coordinated entry program enrollment is problematic because coordinated entry is an interagency, system-wide process. We created coordinated entry as a program in HMIS to draw a boundary around the coordinated entry process, so we can track a household's journey through coordinated entry, from access to exit, which is ideally permanent housing. HMIS is used to facilitate the coordinated entry process in the Texas Balance of State, and this does not inhibit the participation of victim service providers. Victim service providers play a critical role in the housing crisis response system because they are experts on the dynamics of family violence and provide specialized supportive services for survivors. They are, however, statutorily prohibited from entering data into HMIS. They are encouraged to serve as an entry point where they can complete a coordinated entry enrollment on paper or in a comparable database. Then they will connect to an agency designated for entering information into HMIS. And during the referral process, they can act as the liaison between the household and a receiving agency. Victim service providers must follow the confidentiality provisions outlined in the Violence Against Women Act and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. These provisions allow households to request that their information be shared by a victim service provider to another agency through a time-limited, informed, and written consent. To support victim service providers, the Texas Balance of State has developed a training called Coordinated Entry for Victim Service Providers. Because coordinated entry is an interagency, system-wide process, information can be collected over time by multiple providers in electronic, paper, and verbal formats. As a result, THN, as the HMIS lead agency, has developed privacy protections regarding HMIS, how data are collected, used, stored, and disclosed across the system. Every HMIS user will complete a training module called HMIS Privacy and Security. In this section, we discuss how coordinated entry is set up in the Texas Balance of State Continuum of Care. There are 7 principles which guide our approach to coordinated entry. Second, participation in coordinated entry can be described in 2 ways: coordinated entry planning and coordinated entry process. Both work hand in hand and impact each other. The coordinated entry process includes the 4 core elements: access, assessment, referral, and prioritization. And lastly, the coordinated entry process uses HMIS for data entry unless the agency is a victim service provider. Thank you for watching one of 2 videos about coordinated entry. If you or your agency is interested in participating in a local coordinated entry process, please contact the Systems Change team at ce@thn.org. There is a separate and formal training process for staff members involved in a local coordinated entry process.